Hello, friends. Welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith, and I'm glad to be with you again today. As we know, the coronavirus has created an enormous crisis in Western society and, of course, around the world. Those of us who profess Jesus as Lord depend on his words and deeds, not only in this life, but really in the life to come. And our trust is rooted not in ourselves, but in the promises of God, his pledges to us, and what we often refer to as his covenant. Now today, my friend and colleague, Dr. Scott Stripling, joins us from Texas to talk about exactly that, God's covenant, spelled out in his newly released book, The Power of Covenant in Times of Crisis. Now, Scott, welcome back to Digging for Truth. It's great to see you, my friend.
Hey, thanks, Henry. Thrilled to be with you, brother.
Well, we're glad to have you on the show. So in the providence of God, you were working on co-authoring a book, Scott, The Power of Covenant in Times of Crisis. So we'll just jump right in because we want to talk about your book. And I'm telling you, I've read through it and it's just really uplifting and powerful, and just love for you to share about it. Maybe you could start with telling about a little bit about why you wrote the book and your co-author who wrote with you.
Henry, the impetus of the book came from Ralph Peel, who's a longtime friend of mine and a member of our dig team for many years. Ralph is a retired medical doctor, and he came to me and said, hey, I've been looking at these 9/11 verses in the Bible, chapter 9, verse 11, and they all seem to deal with covenant. And so he and I started looking at it, and of course we both realized there's no Bible code that's involved there, but I thought it was a really cool mnemonic device to help people remember concepts about covenant. And so Ralph said, hey, I want to write a book on this, but I don't think I can do it on my own. I need a co-author, and you'll bring some color from the archaeological world and theological world, and would you do it with me? I was so busy at the time, but Ralph is such a dear friend that I couldn't say no. And so somehow we carved out the time for this. And in God's providence, I mean, he knew not only that COVID-19 was coming, but he knew that we were going to start working on this book and preparing it for publication. And so lo and behold, when we were ready to publish, the world turned topsy-turvy, and here we were with a book on crisis coming out during the midst of a crisis.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable in the providence of God. It's great to have a co-author for a book. I've done a little bit of articles and stuff to have a co-author. It's great to partner with somebody when you're writing something. So now, Dr. Peel's a medical doctor, and so you guys sort of work together on this. But I guess we go back to what I introduced in the beginning was, the pledges and promises of God, what we call covenant. Maybe you could explore that a little bit more. The term covenant, do we find that in the Bible, and what does it mean?
Sure. Well, the term covenant is very interesting, and it's used normally in the concept of cutting covenant, because covenant always involves blood. So in the Bible, for example, we have 7 primary covenants, starting with the Edenic covenant in the Garden of Eden, and then ending up with the new covenant, which essentially restores us to an Edenic state, or the potential at least to restore us to an Edenic state, which is direct relationship with God. Each one of those covenants has blood associated with it. And so we think classically about Leviticus 17:11, quoted by the writer of Hebrews, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. And so we trace that theme through the Bible, and along the way, we explore a lot of different real-life situations, from the Kennedy assassination, COVID-19, and other crises that the world has faced. Is the Bible applicable in the modern world? Can we take these ancient concepts of covenant and what God says and apply them to our world?
Yeah, it's interesting. You in the book, you and Ralph lay out those 7 covenants right from the beginning, and when you mentioned the shedding of blood, it's interesting because the fall account, even though it doesn't mention per se the shedding of blood, it's implied in God putting the animal skins on Adam and Eve. in order for that to happen, obviously
Right.
an animal had to die. So even though it's not developed there, it's there.
Well, that's right.
In
And
the
in
narrative.
fact, I would say that that would be the blood of the Adamic covenant. That's after the fall. So the shedding of innocent blood to cover the
Yes.
guilty. Whereas
Yes.
in the Edenic covenant, you start thinking, where's the blood? Um, that rib came from somewhere, brother. And so, God being the first anesthesiologist and the first surgeon, opened up Adam's side, and there was the blood. And
Yeah.
so, as part of that covenant, it's the shedding of blood.
Yeah, benevolent surgery. Yeah, thanks for correcting me on that. The Adamic covenant, obviously,
Yeah.
after the fall. Um, so, you know, in your book, you talk a little bit about the nature of some of these covenants. Some have conditions and some are unconditional.
Mm.
Maybe got about a minute and a half in this segment here, Scott. Explore maybe that a little bit.
Okay, well, first of all, let me define covenant, and then I'll quickly
Yes,
answer that.
sure.
A covenant is not a contract, and sometimes people confuse them. A covenant has a greater party and a lesser party. So if it's equal parties, then it can't be covenant. It's partnership or kinship or friendship, but it's not covenant. So
Yeah,
in covenant, you have a greater party who extends an offer to a lesser party who can negotiate the terms, but once they're entered into, then there's a recognition of a greater party and a lesser party. And I think that's a very important distinction when we're trying to understand exactly what covenant is and how it works. Now, what was the question?
well, that's all right. Was talking about sort of maybe just we got about a minute, so maybe you could just touch on some of the conditional and unconditional
Right.
elements of the covenant.
Well, this is a good point because sometimes people are confused. The Abrahamic covenant, for example, is a unilateral covenant, and the Mosaic covenant is a bilateral covenant. So, the unilateral is God is going to keep it regardless of your behavior. The
Right.
bilateral is conditional upon your behavior. In other words, if you don't keep the terms that you agreed to, then the blessings of that covenant are annulled, they're nullified. God's promises to Abraham were unilateral. And even in the cutting of that covenant, it was God who passed through the fire twice. First, the greater covenant, and then for Abraham in a theophany and fire, a second time for Abraham. So God's keeping both ends of the covenant when it's unilateral. So when we
Yes.
get into the New Testament and Paul is making his arguments in Galatians and Romans, it's important that we realize he's talking about the Abrahamic covenant there, not the Mosaic covenant.
The Mosaic. That's a great way to sum it up. We'll pick up some more of that, Scott, when we come back right after this message.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith, and I'm here today with Dr. Scott Stripling. Now, Scott is an archaeologist and the director of our excavations at Biblical Shiloh. But today we're talking about covenant, particularly God's covenants with people, and particularly with us as his church now during the age of the new covenant, which we're going to explore in a moment. Now, Scott, when we left off our last segment, we began to get into the different kinds of covenants. We talked a little bit about unconditional and conditional natures. Maybe we can explore that a little bit. Some of the other covenants that are given to us in the Bible, just to give an overarching picture for our audience.
Okay, so first of all, the number 7 is very significant. We have 7 covenants, and this is completion. So we start with the Edenic covenant, and after the fall, God institutes the Adamic covenant. Now, you understand God never changes, but the stipulations by which he interacts with us can change. So Henry, you have this darling little girl who lives with you, whose name is Ava, And
Yes.
she's under strict supervision. She cannot go where she wants. She has to get permission, and she's pretty much does what she's told when she's told, or she has consequences for that. The poor Ava is living under the Adamic covenant right now. Okay. Now, one day I know that you don't want to hear this, but one day she's going to be free and independent of you and B, and she's going to make her own decisions. But
Yes.
what you have trained her and taught her to do and to be will guide her during those times. And that's would be all the way on the other end, say the new covenant. So she's been guided. So she's right now got rules and restrictions that are shaping her. So in this redemptive process in humanity, each covenant lays out new stipulations. And so you have Edenic and Adamic, and then the Noahic covenant. And so,
Yeah.
of course, the first thing Noah does when he gets off the ark is what? Sacrifice.
Yes.
And
Yes.
again, through the shedding of blood, that there's a reconnection, and the seal of the covenant then being the rainbow.
It's very interesting. I like your analogy, the family analogy. I've it's applying it at a very fundamental level at the family unit, but really be in the background, no matter what the situation is with correction and guidance, is always what I would say is the Abrahamic covenant. My love for you is unconditional, but then there's stipulations inside of that as far as the law goes, sort of the Mosaic dimension of the relationship, but the Abrahamic background never changes. Father's love for his daughter or son, or parents' love, and so much so more so with God.
Well, let's talk about the Abrahamic covenant a little bit, because that comes next. And 4 of the 7 covenants are in the book of Genesis. So the Genesis is a book of covenant.
Yeah.
So when God begins to reveal himself to Abraham, this reaches a climax, and he causes Abraham to fall into a deep sleep, just like Adam. I think the wording is a deep and terrible darkness came over Abraham. So in other words, the brother is in a profound sleep, and God appears to him, and you have this covenantal interaction where Abraham is told to get 5 animals, and he cuts them in half. God doesn't tell him to cut them in half. He knows what to do. And then in this sleep, he sees the appearance of God, and God passes through the blood. And then, right, the greater party always goes first. And so he passes through the blood, and in a symbolic form, in fire. And then the second time, now it's Abraham's turn, the lesser party. And of course, God has said to Abraham, walk before me and be perfect all the days of your life. Well, if you've read the Bible, that's a big problem for Abraham, okay? And it's a big problem for me, because, we've got issues. And he knows that when his feet touch that blood, he's a dead man. So God then shows up again in another theophany in fire, a smoking pot, and passes through the blood a second time. So it's unilateral. God is keeping both ends of the covenant. Now, if I can real quickly tie this together, you look at a wedding ceremony today in, say, a Bedouin culture. They still practice this same thing. So there's 5 animals, they're separated, there's a path of blood. The father of the groom, it's the greater party, goes first. Not the guy getting married, but the father. And he walks through the blood, and he points at his footprints, and he says, may this be done to my blood if my son is at everything I promised that he's going to be. And then the father of the bride does the same thing. He walks through the blood, he points at his footprints and says, may this be done to my blood if my daughter is in everything I promise you that she's going to be. Well, this very day in that culture, if that guy broke the covenant or that girl broke the covenant, you would find the father of the bride or the father of the groom with his throat slit and footprints in the blood. You see,
that's pretty serious.
Yeah, that's accountability.
Yeah. Extraordinary.
It's often said that Eastern marriages start at a simmer and build up to a boil, and Western marriages start at a boil and cool down to a simmer. Maybe we can understand a little bit of the reason why when we understand covenant better.
Yeah, it's interesting how that cultural practice has made its way down through the millennia. So many parallels there, Scott. I think people are probably connecting very quickly Jesus to this, who walks through that suffering or that blood, if you will, except it's his own blood.
Yeah, amen. Well, the Mosaic covenant, of course, is the bloodiest of all. You have once they begin to sacrifice bulls, and when the Israelites make this big mistake of the golden calf,
Yes.
they of course worshipped Hathor, they worshipped the calf in Egypt, and Apis the bull. God essentially says to them, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. From now on, every day, twice a day, 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, we're going to sacrifice a bull." And you think you love Apis, you think you love Hathor, we're going to sacrifice twice a day.
Yeah.
And you start adding up those days, twice a day times 365 times over 1,400 years, and it comes out to almost 1 million sacrifices, just the bulls that are dealt with.
Extraordinary.
And it's not until the Babylonian captivity that finally this idolatry is worked out of them in God's salvific process, his salvation history that he's unfolding.
Yeah. Well, folks, we're really having an extraordinary conversation here with Dr. Stripling talking about covenant and blood and how serious covenant is. And of course, we know how serious it is with God. And in our next segment, we're going to be talking a little bit, well, how do we apply the promises of this covenant to times of crisis that we're going through right now? And folks, we hope you're enjoying this episode. We'll be back just in a few moments. Don't go away.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm here today talking with Dr. Scott Stripling about the power of covenant and how do we apply covenant? What do we know about covenant? How do we understand it? And particularly in times of crisis. Scott, thank you so much for your explanation of covenant, getting into the details about blood and the seriousness of covenant. We want to shift a little bit now because the title of your book has to do with also crisis. Perhaps you could explore that a little bit. Okay, we've got promises of God, but we live in this fallen context where crisis is either upon us or always seems to be looming. Maybe we could explore that some.
Well, the ancient Greeks saw life as cyclical. History repeated itself. Even look, say, at the war shield of Achilles. It has a scene of birth and then a toddler crawling and then a boy and then a young man and then marriage and having children and becoming a grandfather, an old man, and then dying. So it's a cycle of life. And that's the Greek mindset, that life was cyclical. The Hebrew mindset was different. It was linear. So the world had a definite beginning, it will have a definite end, and we're going somewhere in history. And of course, the two could be combined in a sense. It could be cyclical and linear, sort of going in a direction, not to say that there aren't cycles that are involved. So in covenant, Henry, we see that God's sovereignty controls the affairs of man. And this is a big issue in our world today. Is life random? Do things just happen because they just happen? Nobody's in control, or maybe the devil's in control, and that's why everything's happening. Whereas the message of covenant from beginning to end is that God sovereignly controls the affairs of men. These things, like COVID-19, for example, they often catch us by surprise. I mean, they certainly caught me by surprise. I didn't see this coming. But they don't catch God by surprise. Yeah. And he's aware, and if we will respond covenantally according to the way that the covenant instructs us to, then we have great confidence. We're not shaken. Our world isn't turned upside down because we know that God is causing all things to work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes.
Yeah, that's a great word. We have to preach that to ourselves, and we want to encourage our audience in that. Scott, something that's not a covenant per se, but something I thought of that is deeply covenantal is the incident with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You remember what they say to Nebuchadnezzar? They say, we're not going to bow down and worship, false gods. If you put us in the fire, our God is able to rescue us. But even if he doesn't, we are not going to worship your false gods, because they had a covenantal view, a eternal view, that even if they perished in that fire, that they would be with God for eternity. They had a long-term covenantal perspective. And that's kind of like, boy, do I want to apply that mindset to this crisis that we're dealing with.
Here's the way that we put it in the book, Henry. Nothing can happen to me without God's permission. And if he allows it, then it's good for me, even unto death.
Wow.
And the point is that life is not about me and my happiness. Life is about God and his glory. And when we adopt that mindset, it's very empowering. I can face any type of trial with great confidence, knowing that God is at work to will and to do of his good pleasure.
Yeah. That is a great word for the church and for us as individuals. You and I as friends and as colleagues speaking to each other. I mean, we do archaeology and we want to defend the faith and show the scriptures are reliable, to point people to the reliability of this covenant that we have been invited into. It's extraordinary what God has done for us in this covenant. And we want to encourage people to embrace it, encourage ourselves to embrace it and believe it. Even if we, Lord forbid, came down with this terrible sickness.
Right. Well, one thing that people really like about the book is that in the last 2 chapters, Ralph and I share our personal stories of how we have seen God intervene in the world today. And so I share, my own story of kind of crisis early in my life, how I came to faith, and miracles that I've seen God do. As he has intervened in different ways. So we know God can at any time step in. Sometimes he chooses to, sometimes he chooses not to. And that's what's so empowering about covenant. I don't have to second guess myself, and I don't have to second guess God. I'm fully confident in his ability, as the 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace, to rest in that truth.
Yeah, amen. Amen to that. So, Scott, now we have to tell people about, you're talking about this wonderful book, and let's talk about how they can get a copy of the book. It's very easy and very inexpensive. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, we're super excited that lots of people are buying it. We've been on the top 10 list on Amazon for the last few weeks since the book became available on Kindle. And just a few days ago, it became available in print. And so we've been as high as number 2 on Amazon's bestseller list, and it changes every day, but we're generally on the top 10 list, and that's pretty awesome. So we're grateful for that. On Kindle, folks can get it for only $1.99. Now, They should be embarrassed they should send a donation to ABR, for getting it that cheap. But we wanted to get this message. I mean, we would not be opposed to making money, but what we really wanted to do was to get this message into a lot of people's hands who were trying to understand crisis. And if they're Amazon Prime members, they can even get it for free. So everybody go and get the book there. And if you really love me, then go out and buy a copy too, a paper copy, and write a review. We need a bunch of folks to go and write those Amazon reviews, and that's what drives the algorithm.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. Scott, I certainly bought it immediately as soon as it was published and read it, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. It was uplifting for me. It was a reminder to me, what do I really believe in this time of crisis? Because, like most people out there, I've felt twinges of fear. I've felt, is not doubting that God's in control, but just that sinful humanness in myself. And so reading through your book has helped continue to reground me in the promises of God. Well, Scott, I'll give you 30 seconds to wrap it up. That's what we got. Go for it.
All right. My favorite verse on covenant, Deuteronomy 8:18. Remember the Lord your God, for he is the one who gives you the ability to get wealth in order that he might establish his covenant with you. God wants to prosper our lives. And I'm not guaranteeing someone that they're going to be rich if they become a believer, but I am saying this, that prosperity of our soul and general financial prosperity will also be the trick of the person who follows in covenant with God. And so I would encourage folks to get a copy, to read it, and I think they'll be blessed by the book.
Well, that's a fantastic word, Scott, and it's a great way to end our program. Friends, you can trust in the everlasting covenant of Christ. Thank you for joining us today for Digging for Truth.